This is Open Source Tonight for the week of December the 8th, 2019. And I'm your host, Vincent Maggard. How's it going, everybody? Thanks so much for tuning in today. Billy and Carmen, unfortunately, was not able to join us this week. Billy due to the weather and Carmen due to a power outage in the studio here. And so it caused a scheduling conflict where he wasn't able to join us. So it's just going to be me with you this week. Did not want to leave you out in the air without an episode, so we won't do that. First in the news this week is something that really ticks me off, if I'm being completely honest. Canonical is sponsoring the WSL conference, Microsoft's first Linux conference next year, and I am not happy about this because I'm not happy about the conference. Microsoft is doing an entire conference about their Windows subsystem for Linux thing that you can run Linux, basically a kind of pseudo version of Linux in a weird way. It's kind of like virtualized in a terminal kind of thing on a Windows 10 machine, and that's what they call it. It's the Windows subsystem for Linux. Well, I mean, leave it to Microsoft to start it with Windows, even though it has, well, I mean, I guess it's in the OS. So I guess it counts as being to do with Windows to a point. But I'm very upset with Microsoft over this because they're taking a whole conference that could be about Linux in general and open source in general, and what they're doing is they're taking it and they're making it all about their thing and their proprietary operating system, and that's just not fair to me to do a conference that is supposed to be about open source that basically isn't. But everyone's entitled to their opinion. I'm sure some of you actually think this is a great thing, and I mean, I'll grant you Microsoft has went in a less bad direction, I guess, over the years, but I have my issues with them to this day because Microsoft, I just don't trust them in open source. I don't trust them. They may actually turn out to be great stewards of open source software in the future. Who knows? Some may argue they are now. I would disagree with those people, but you're welcome to disagree. But I don't know. This is definitely not a conference I want to go to. It sounds really stupid. And there may even be a fee for it. I should probably check and see if there's a fee for it. But like, seriously, I mean, I honestly don't understand why that I really don't understand why that Microsoft cares so much about open source, other than the fact that it's probably making them money. I mean, with Azure, I know they're from what they've been talking about, it makes them a lot of money, and that runs a lot of Linux, but I don't know. Let's see. I feel like this is probably something that actually you have to pay to get into. A lot of conferences you have to pay. Oh, it's actually free. Interesting. Well, I mean, you know, I'll say this. I figured Microsoft would charge for it. So you know what? They have a little bit more of my respect automatically just by not charging for it. That's a little bit better. So there you go. That's great. But, you know, I don't know. I'm not really the biggest fan of Microsoft, as many know. And I don't know. I just don't trust them in open source. I really don't. And I am very concerned for the future of things like Ubuntu, because I could see Ubuntu and Canonical being purchased by Microsoft. And I went to Linux partially because I like a Unix-like operating system, yes, but partially because I didn't want to be in the Microsoft proprietary crazy piece of crap operating system called Windows. And I at one point used Mac OS, and, you know, Apple was giving me issues on Mac OS with things I didn't like. Among other things, I couldn't repair the computers that, you know, the new computers that was running it as easy. And I want a computer where if I want to put a new hard drive in it, I just take the case off and I put a new hard drive in and I slide the case lid back on, or if the laptop, I take the bottom off or whatever. But you can't do that with a lot of Apple's products. I mean, the Mac Pro, yeah, you can do it with that, but its starting price is like $6,000. I ain't got that kind of money laying around just to buy a computer. You know what I'm saying? That's a lot of money for a lot of us, and it's not even designed for me anyways. It's designed for people that are making lots and lots of money, probably in like film and stuff, and you know, who knows, maybe someday I'll be a major filmmaker, but right now I just make YouTube videos. It's not really a justification for a $5,000 box, is it? But anyway, yeah, so continuing on here in the news, kind of got off topic there for a little bit. VirtualBox 6.1 debuts with Linux 5.4 support added, accelerated video playback, and more. I'm reading the quote, the title here from OMG Ubuntu. As usual, these are all OMG Ubuntu stories, and links will be in the show notes. But this is interesting, I have to say. You know, I actually moved away from VirtualBox to boxes because I kept having issues with some distros in it, and Boxes is pretty good, but I have to say I used VirtualBox for years, so maybe I'll give it another shot, maybe go back to it. But accelerated video playback on Linux hosts, that's a great thing that they've added. So I would think that means if you're playing video back in a Windows VM, for example, for some reason, that it would properly accelerate. Or who knows, maybe they're applying it in some other way, but I would think that would be the way it would be used. Maybe they actually mean that's like accelerating the actual drawing of the video from the desktop itself. Maybe that's what they mean. I don't really know for sure, but either one could be good. And they've also added support, like I said, to the kernel 5.4, so that's pretty cool. They've done a bunch of different things. Some experimental changes, according to the article here, says that they are including an VBox IM mount, which is not even a thing I knew existed, to be honest, which is a command here that comes with VirtualBox, allows for read-only access to NTFS, FAT, and ex2, 3, and 4 file systems inside a disk image. So that's interesting. I think that's a new thing. A glut of new GUI tweaks are also offered as well, so that's good. Their GUI, could use some work in some areas in the older versions, I would think. For one thing, it's Qt, and that can cause some issues on some Linux distros. So, anyway. But yeah, I think that pretty much covers the VirtualBox thing. Pretty cool stuff. Hopefully, you can get some use out of it. I think I may have to give it a try. And wrapping up our news for the week, it's going to be kind of a short episode this week. We've got Ubuntu 2004's LTS survey out now, and now you can shape the future of the OS if you'd like. So you can go, again, we'll put a link in the description to both the article as well as the survey link if you would like to submit your thoughts on the next LTS. I have to say 1804 is pretty darn good. I'm not really sure what they could really do that or need to do that would make me like 2004 better. The only real thing I have against 1804 is snaps, but to be fair, they got that I think in 1604 too. So I don't like snaps, but I'm warming up to them. I noticed that Snap apps are starting to theme to the OS properly now, which is one of the big things I used to have against them is, they wouldn't theme right a lot of the times, and I want everything to look, correct. If it's a GTK app, it should theme to the GTK theme and look correct. So I'm glad to see that it seems like they've fixed that already in 1804. So, I can't really see something I would want in 2004. Maybe there's something out there, but I don't know. Maybe if I ever switch to 4K, which I haven't done yet, maybe they could do some things to optimize 4K. I'm not even clear on how good 4K support is. I think they've got in the GNOME desktop they ship in 1804. I think they have 4K support on that, but it's kind of limited support, So I think that could be improved for sure. And eventually I will probably start doing 4K video, so it would be good to eventually have screens, that can handle 4K correctly. But as of right now, I don't really see I don't see really much of a reason for me to go to 1804, honestly, or 2004, honestly, immediately. And, I don't really know what I would even say on the survey, but I guess I'll try going and filling it out at some point and just seeing, what their questions are. And maybe I can put them in the right direction, even though I think they're pretty much doing what I want anyway, from what I can gather. But yeah, so that's your news for the week now. One of the things I wanted to bring up now that we're done with the week, let's do one more news story. I was just looking and I've seen this story. Zorin OS 15.1 has been released. It adds LibreOffice 6.3 and dark mode scheduling. And I'm guessing dark mode scheduling is like it can be at night, the dark mode turns on, which actually is a pretty cool feature. I like dark all the time myself, but here it says, lastly, but by no means the least, there are some improvements to the Zorin auto theme feature, which apparently already was there. So it can transition between black and dark themes, and they've basically just done some bug fixes on it. So that's awesome that they've worked in that. Zorin is not my cup of tea, but I definitely care about it because if we can have OSs like Zorin for Windows users to come over to Linux, something that looks familiar to them, that's easier for them to understand, that they're going to be comfortable with, we can have a lot more Linux users in the future, hopefully. And I definitely would like to see more Linux users. So, I think it's great. I just don't like it for me. I'm not really, at this point, I use Linux and I've used Mac and I've used Windows. And, I don't really care if my OS looks identical to Windows. And I mean, my current Linux setup is actually more like a Mac with like a dock on the bottom of the screen and stuff. Basically it's the GNOME desktop with dash to dock installed and a dock on the bottom of the screen that goes out of the way. And I think for me, that's all I need, so, but that's me, not all Linux users are going to be me. And I want them to have the choice of something that looks more like Windows. I would think personally, Linux Mint Cinnamon is great. Like, see, the thing for me is I like Linux Mint Cinnamon more for a new Windows user. This is my opinion than I would, or not a new Windows user, but a new Linux user coming from Windows, right? And they want that Windows style experience. I think that Linux Mint with the Cinnamon desktop gives a very complete package with support for things Linux users and Windows users would kind of, what's going to have things Windows users expect. You've got access to the Ubuntu repos where most software you would want is available. So, like, for example, you can get Chromium, you can install Chrome on, Debian, Ubuntu-based distros, so that would mean Linux Mint. And so I think for a lot of users, Linux Mint's just the right way to go when moving over. But, that's all my opinion. And obviously, the user needs to make the right choice. And this is actually really important because we're going to segue now into the important thing, one of the important things here coming up. And that is that I want to talk about Windows users that want to move to Linux. Windows 7 end of life is very, very quickly approaching. Windows 7, that is. And I used to be a Windows 7 user. I did not like Windows 10. I moved to Linux full-time a few years ago from Windows 7. I had used Mac OS for a few years, went back to Windows 7, and I liked Mac OS, just didn't like the price of the machines and the non-open source, but Windows wasn't open source either. But I went back to Windows for a while, Windows 7. I did not want to use 10. I tried it on a machine for a few months one time, and it was not for me. I did not like it. It was, privacy invading for one thing. But two, even if you don't care about your privacy, and there is ways to kind of lock it down and stuff, especially if you have a pro-level version where you can go into, what's it called? I forget. It's one of the system management tools, Group Policy Editor. If you go into Group Policy Editor, there's a lot of things you can turn off on a pro or higher level version. And the thing is, I have never liked Windows in my whole life. Let's be clear. I never liked it. I mean, Windows 7 was my favorite version of it, XP before that. And honestly, even though they weren't bad, I have to say, the way that Linux and Mac OS does things, both, I think is better. This is an opinion, obviously, but I just think it's better. I like those workflows better. I like my Unix-like workflows better. I like having Bash pre-installed in the system. I know Windows 10's kind of got that now with the Windows subsystem for Linux, but the thing is, I just like the way Linux works. I like the open source part of it, and I don't want to be around Microsoft stuff. I mean, I'm going to be honest about it. Look, I just don't like Microsoft stuff. I've had a lot of issues with Windows over the years, and I'm not a new user. I know a lot of the things to try to keep a Windows system in good shape. I don't do things to a Windows system that would get viruses on it, right? I try very hard to keep my systems in tip-top condition. Here's the problem. Even when you do that, Windows can have issues. It can have stability problems. And I mean, I'm not saying Linux is perfect. It's not. And there is some distros that are rolling release like Arch where you can have stability issues, but you're choosing that, right? If you're going to something like Ubuntu, it's going to be pretty stable, right? So for me, I wanted stability, and that's one of the main things I need out of my computer is something that I know when I need to edit a video, when I need to record a show, when I need to write some code, whatever I need to do, I need a machine that's going to let me do it right then. It's not going to randomly update in the middle of it and stop my work. It's not going to crash on me randomly and make me lose a lot of my work, right? I don't have to worry about any of those things on Linux, really, especially on a stable distribution like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, etc. But anyway, back to the topic I was trying to get to here. Windows users wanting to switch to Linux, I have a couple things I'd like to go over with those listening if you're thinking of making the move. So as someone that's actually moved from Windows to Linux, these are some things to keep in mind, specifically Windows 7. Okay, first of all, if you want a Windows 7 style environment, look at something like Linux Mint Cinnamon. You are going to have a very well put together distribution out of the box, and you're going to have a Windows-like feel. It's not going to be perfectly like Windows, but it's going to be close enough that you're going to be able to recognize, their kind of equivalent of the start menu and understand how that works pretty quickly. That's going to help you a lot if you're used to that workflow. And once you get used to it, then you can move on out to something, if you want, that is different. Now, you could stay on Linux Mint for years. And honestly, I'm thinking about making my main system Linux Mint. I like how much they have attention to detail and how they're concerned about stability and everything. But I like Ubuntu as well. Like, we'll see which one I end up going with. But the thing is, whichever one you go with, I wouldn't recommend Ubuntu stock for a new user, honestly. To me, the perfect new user distribution right now, me and Jon Collins pretty much agrees on this, either Ubuntu Mate for a new user that wants to have a little more of a stake, if you will, as John would say, in their computer and how things work. And, kind of want to do that last 10% of the work on it. Or if you just want something complete out of the box, right, I would say, and you're more of a, I'm not invested, I just want to get something done, then Linux Mint, probably with the Cinnamon desktop, is the way to go. And, the thing is, that's, just my opinion, but I think that's the best way to go. And, people like Jon Collins has switched a lot of Windows users over. That seems to be a good way to do it. I actually put my mom on Ubuntu Mate when I switched her over, and she liked that. But she had used Windows for years at work. So she was, I don't want to say she was a computing expert, but I think she fit in the Ubuntu Mate world all right. Maybe it would have been better to put her on Linux Mint with Cinnamon, but it turned out good for her. But the thing is, I would advise for most users Linux Mint Cinnamon, and if you know you want more stake in your system, go to Ubuntu Mate. So that's what I would advise. Now, another thing I would advise, do not install Linux on your main machine, right? Have a little cheap laptop or something that you can install Linux on, use it for a month or two, the distro that you're looking at, and see on hardware how you like it, how it functions. You need to make sure that you're going to have something that you can get used to and that's going to do the things you need before you switch to it full time, right? Another big thing too, you really want to start doing this pretty soon because Windows 7 end of life is not far from now. We are talking, I think it's January the 14th of next year. Official support is ended for consumers. So you definitely need to be on the way out of Windows 7 for your own security. When those patches stop coming in, you are going to have a increased risk for viruses and stuff because they're not going to be patching the holes in the OS that would allow them to get in if there is any still out there. And all software has bugs pretty much. So, and Windows definitely has had its bugs. So you definitely want to make sure you move off it before then for your best security. So I would say start using Linux now on a second machine. The Linux distro of your choice. Also, you need to see what you're going to do on your machine. You need to look up LibreOffice. If you need an Office thing, right, you need to look up things like that. If you need to do video switching, you need to look up OBS Studio. These are just examples. If you need web browsers, those are pretty much all the major web browsers are on Linux. You've got Firefox, you've got Chrome. So, those are your two big main ones. I think Opera's on Linux as well. And they also want to port Edge to Linux in the future. It's not there now, but they want to port it. So if you want to use Edge, which I personally don't understand why you would, but if you want to stay in the Microsoft sandbox a little bit for some reason, or you need to, maybe you need to use Edge for some reason, even though it's based on Chrome, so it should be just like using Chrome. But whatever the reason may be, if you just want to use it, that's coming to Linux as well. Now, if you use a lot of web apps, it's going to be easier for the transition because a lot of times you can just keep using them when you move over, right? So, for example, I like Google Docs. For example, I read a lot of show notes and stuff in Google Docs. I know it's not open source, but it's just easier when I need to contribute with people to write it in there, and then I can send them a link, and they can edit with me in real time. That's great. So, that's one of the things I like about it. But here's the thing, though, right? If you're using mostly web apps, it should be pretty easy to move. However, a lot of us, for example, I do video editing. So I need a video editor. Now, I use Olive right now. I used to use Kden Live at one point. So there's different choices out there on Linux depending on what you're doing. And I also want to acknowledge that you need to make sure Linux will do what you need. Look, not everybody has the ability, sadly, to move to Linux right now. And, if you can't, sadly, maybe just have it on a second machine or something. Sometimes you got to have a Windows machine around for certain things. Or maybe the better thing to do, actually, if you have like one thing you need to do on a Windows machine, have a separate machine that runs Windows just for that purpose, right? You could, like if you play video games, you could have a separate Windows machine just for playing your video games. And then you could do your office work or everything else on Linux, for example. So that's like one option. The other thing I want to point out that's, a big deal too. You need to go, like I said, and search around. This is back to my point I was just saying, actually. But you need to go and look around on Google and see what open source packages that are available on Linux. Most of them are available on Windows as well. And you need to see what will be able to complete your tasks, right? You need to be able to find equivalent applications. Sometimes you're not going to be able to find that exact app that you need on Linux. We don't have Premiere Pro from Adobe, After Effects. We have equivalents, but we don't have those. So you need to look at those other equivalents and see. You can run Olive on Windows, for example. It's a lot like Premiere Pro. It's not as feature rich yet, but it's getting there. So go download that. You can download it on Windows. It's completely free. Try it out. Edit a video in it. See if it can do what you need. And if it can't, maybe it's best for you to stay on Windows. However, there's a lot of good video editors on Linux. So depending on what you're doing, you may still be able to do it in another editor. But I mean, if you have to, for example, contribute with someone that requires you to send them Premiere Pro project files, yeah, you're out of luck. But a lot of users are not people that have to do those things. And for those that do, sadly, you might have to stay on Windows or at least have a Windows machine around. Now, again, you really want to download those apps on a Windows machine. Like I would be doing this now, right? If you need to do an equivalent of Illustrator, download Inkscape. If you need an equivalent of Photoshop, download GIMP, right? So whatever you need, and you need to be learning it. You need to be starting to do those tasks in there and trying to get used to it, and only going back to those other applications if you have to, right? So because you want to actually be able to get those users, you want to be able to get the used to those new applications to be able to get your work done, right? So you want to be doing that. If you're deploying it to a business and you got a bunch of users, you need to get them used to it. You need to slowly break them into open source apps, right? Start them with LibreOffice, and slowly work their way up, right? Instead of Outlook, use Thunderbird and so forth. And you will slowly get to the point to where that your users will be familiar with enough things that when you move them over to Linux, or yourself, if you're doing this to yourself, will be comfortable. And once you do that, then you can be on Linux. You can, dump the Windows machine unless you need it, like I said, for those specific applications you have to have. And again, you could have a dedicated machine, treat it like an appliance, right? Once you do that, then you can enjoy Linux, and you can be free of the Windows world, at least partially, if not entirely, depending on what you have to do. So these are just some tips for that. Also, just a side note, some of these things was partially inspired by Jon Collins and partially inspired by Tom at Switch to Linux. So shout out to those guys for over the last little bit kind of giving me the idea maybe we should talk about Windows 7 and getting people over there. So thank you so much to the two of you for giving me kind of the idea we should put this as a podcast topic at some point. So, but yeah, this is pretty much the show for this week. Please send us feedback at feedback@opensourcetonight.com, feedback@opensourcetonight.com. Check us out. We have a YouTube channel. We have all kinds of cool stuff. And again, thank you everybody so much for tuning in to the episode this week. We greatly appreciate our listeners. So I'm so sorry that, our other host was not able to be here with you this week. So again, my sincerest apologies to that, but unfortunately things happen, But again, I'm very glad that you were able to listen to this episode. I hope I didn't bore you to death. And until next week, this is Open Source Tonight. And I'm Vincent. Catch you later, everybody.